Hi, welcome to Werks. Today is another episode of my 52 cards in 52 weeks challenge. Last week I drew a 9 of hearts, so today we're going to be doing a scrap metal build.
I really had no idea what I was going to make for this project, but as soon as I got up to my bench, it became pretty clear that something was missing. So in thinking about all the scrap metal I have, I remembered that I have this big bucket full of random nuts and bolts that I picked up on a job a while ago, and I thought it would be a fun challenge to make a project just out of these. Now, the only kind of welder I have is a TIG welder, which is really great and you can use it for all kinds of things, but the biggest drawback to a TIG welder is that the metal needs to be really clean to get a good weld. These were all used bolts that came from someone who was a mechanic at one point and just had buckets of these things, so I had ended up taking a bucket home with me. And they were all covered in grease and grime, so I went through with my polishing belt and cleaned up all the ends where they would be getting welded. At this point, I could just begin welding some of the bolts together. My thought here was that I would make another three-legged stool. I really like three-legged objects because they aren't able to rock and they're always steady. It really bothers me when you go into a restaurant or something and the table or chairs are rocking. So when I can, I like to make things with 3 legs because they never rock. I was welding the bolts in a pattern where they were kind of straight for the first foot or so and then they began to curve at the top. Once I welded up 2 of these, I decided that I would draw it out on my workbench, the same shape so that I could weld up the rest of them. This is a 3-legged stool, but each leg I made with 2 of these sets of bolts, which will make more sense as I weld it together here. So I ended up having to make 6 of these total. And there were some cool bolts in the bunch. Some were stamped from Germany and Italy, so it's cool to think about what cars these may have come off of. And I did my best to entirely weld around each bolt, and then you can see here I used my little TIG torch holder as a rest. For some of the weirder angles, I could kind of hold the piece with my hand and weld the rest of the way around. Before I decided to go full-time as a woodworker on my own, I worked as a welder for about 5 years. And I always enjoyed when you had tricky positions or tricky fixtures, just to find a way to hold your hand or the part or whatever it was that you had to do to figure out how to weld it. And this here was a prime example of something that was really actually difficult for me to figure out how I was going to hold it in place to weld it. And then I remembered that I had these little V-blocks. These are made by Lufkin. I got these in a lot of other machinist tools, so I don't have any idea how old they are, but they're super handy. I've seen bigger ones, but I've never seen any other ones that are this small, and they worked out great for clamping the bolts in place. And then I could put some of the other V-blocks on as weights, and I used 1, 2, 3 blocks as spacers so that I could make all of the legs the same. And once I tacked those 2 bolts together on the end, the leg held together pretty well and I could remove all the fixtures. And then I welded some of the smaller bolts in as little trusses to go up the sides of the legs to add some strength and a little bit of flair. Here's another shot of using that same fixture setup. Once I figured that all out, it went pretty easily and I could weld up the rest of the legs the same way. This all worked out great, but it sure did make me miss the giant fixture table I used to be able to weld on every day. Some of these bolts were really cool, like this giant square-headed bolt. I have no idea what that was from, but why not put it in the stool? And since some of the bolts were a little longer than the others, the legs weren't all perfectly the same size, so some of them I had to just snip the end with an angle grinder. To attach the 3 legs together, I put a giant stainless nut in between and welded them to that. Unfortunately, this is not the best camera shot, but it was a bit of a balancing act to hold the pieces up while I welded them together. And for the seat, I decided I would weld it all out of nuts. So I had to do the same thing cleaning them all up, but since it took about an hour to clean all the bolts, I figured nobody would want to watch that again, even though the time lapse was about 10 seconds. And I just welded these in a bit of a honeycomb pattern, welding the corners together and going outward from there. With all the nuts welded together, I decided to add a bit of a perimeter, so I put 6 bolts around the edge to give it a bit more of a finished look, and I was really happy with the way this seat turned out. I wanted to make this stool height adjustable, so I took this piece of threaded rod and used it to weld in a nut, and then I used these couple bolts to weld the seat to the nut, and just using that piece of threaded rod as support in the meantime. Once those were in place, I could unscrew the threaded rod, letting it stick out of the bottom about 4 inches. Then I could weld it in place, sticking out of the bottom, which would screw into the nut that holds the legs together. Although it probably wasn't necessary, I wanted to add a little bit of a support on the bottom too, so I took 3 longer bolts and welded them all to a nut, and then I used some 1-2-3 blocks to support that piece in the middle, which I could weld to all 3 legs.
Oh, that's not bad. I like this. Surprisingly comfortable. Well, I hope you enjoyed my scrap metal challenge. I built this stool using only nuts and bolts, so I could take the wooden stool back to the wood shop. With that, I'm going to pick my card for next week. What are we going to build? 5 of clubs. Torrefied poplar build. So next week I'm going to be building something out of torrefied poplar. If you don't know what that means, come on back next week and I'll have that video up. Anyways, thanks for watching.